They went to the United States Navy and they said, hey, we found a U-boat 65 miles off New Jersey. And the Navy said, we didn't sink it. And went to the Germans, and the Germans said, we didn't lose it. So they have this U-boat. They know it's a U-boat.
You could hear the phone get silent for a minute. And I said to her, it's a bullshit story. There's no U-boat in Boston Harbor.
The Germans were saying, well, it's not our U-boat, but if it is, you got to keep your hands off it. And they went, well, hold it. It's either your U-boat or it's not.
If you think a German U-boat would actually come into Boston Harbor and then be sunk and nobody would know about it, this is a bullshit story.
And Paula looks at me and she says, we're doing this, right? Yeah, there you go.
It had been so fatigued from 70 years underwater that it split in two and exploded and blew up his garage.
They knew when they entered the U-869, they could see the bones. They knew that this was a ship on which people had died. There was a whole, in the control room, it's littered with bones.
History X membership has its privileges. To access unedited versions of this and many other History X videos, consider becoming a History X member. If you like shipwrecks, I think you're really going to like this because Richie Kohler is going to join us tonight. You may recognize him as one of the deep sea detectives from the History Channel, and he is going to give us a little bit of the background story behind his identification of the German sub, the U-869. So I'm thrilled to have him on. Let me introduce some of the other guys. John from the USS Slater, upper left-hand corner. Shane from the Buffalo Naval Park, upper right. And then Connor Kilgore, bottom right, from the Transportation Museum of Thunder Bay. And then, like I said a few moments ago, Richie Kohler joining us. His background, he's originally out of Brooklyn, New York, recreational diver who kind of learned the ropes from other experienced divers in the 1990s, kind of like the Wild West when it came to wreck diving. So he learned a lot from other experienced divers, eventually started exploring the Andrea Doria, and with the help of some friends, came across the site of the U-boat 869, and it was made popular by a Nova broadcast called Hitler's Lost Sub. That's how I originally heard of this story. It was fascinating. I loved it. And then a best-selling book called Shadow Divers by an author by the name of Robert Kurson. Fantastic book. I enjoyed it quite a bit. I read it when it first came out, read it again recently, and the book still holds up because it's a fascinating, fascinating story. Matter of fact, at the end, if you want to read this book, if you want to grab a copy of it, there is a link in the description below on the History X channel. Click on that. It'll take you right to it. I'm just thrilled to have you here, first of all. If you ever said I would have been talking to Richie Kohler from the History Channel, I was like, why would that ever be possible? So thank you for joining us.
No, pleasure to be here. You know, listening to you tell my story, it's been a crazy ride that literally started with the discovery of this unknown shipwreck, which at first, when it was discovered in 1991 by Captain Bill Nagel and the crew of the Seeker, that boat that's on screen right now, everybody on board were amateur divers. They were plumbers, electricians, mostly blue-collar guys that worked their job 9 to 5, and on the weekend would pack a lunch and go out on boats just like this to go out into the Atlantic Ocean and dive shipwrecks. A select few would plunk their money down on gambles to go out and find virgin shipwrecks. And I wasn't on that trip when the Seeker went out with a full crew to go out and look at an unknown target on the bottom. Sometimes these things are just rocks, sometimes they're old barges, but Labor Day of 1991, they stumbled on what was arguably the remains of a World War II shipwreck. Because it was so deep and the conditions turbid and they couldn't see much, there was a little bit of an argument. Some people thought it might have been a barge. But one person, John Chatterton, had seen what he believed to be an angled hatch. And although his brain was numb with narcosis, that's John right there, he thought he saw a torpedo inside it. Now, when they came back, the first thing they did was they started looking in a lot of the guidebooks and historical references to shipwrecks off the coast of New Jersey. and there was no submarine lost in this area. So what John had seen, a lot of people ridiculed. It would be the second trip out to this wreck site when two things would happen. First would be that the visibility was a little bit better, and John was able to confirm it was absolutely a submarine. Its nationality unknown, but tragically the shipwreck took the first of what would be 3 lives over the 6 years it took us to identify it. Steve Feldman was diving on the wreck when he experienced some kind of difficulty and passed out underwater. It would be months before his body would be recovered. That's really where I come into this story, because I hadn't been party to those first 2 dives. But with the death of Steve Feldman, a lot of people realized that this wreck was dangerous. It was deeper than what they had been diving. This was a time when technology was pretty much unchanged from when Jacques Cousteau introduced us to scuba diving. Everybody was breathing air. They were just using scuba tanks on their back. There were no diving computers. There was no mixed gases. There was nothing that we use today that would have made these dives any safer. And so I got a call from one of the members of the crew that said, "Hey, we're going back out to this mystery submarine. Would you like to come?" And I said, "Yeah, I mean, this is the kind of thing I lived for at that point."
How old were you at the time?
I was just about 29 years old.
And you'd been diving since you were a teenager?
Yeah, as a matter of fact, before that, when I was 9 years old, my dad introduced me to scuba diving in the beautiful waters of Brooklyn, New York, which is where we lived at the time. But one of the things that's kind of humorous about this adventure is that at the same time the Apollo space program was going off, Neil Armstrong's walking on the moon, my dad took scuba diving lessons, brought me with him, and I sat at the edge of the pool. And for this little kid from Brooklyn, as I watched my dad disappear beneath the surface of the pool, pulling that double regulator over his head, it wasn't hard for me to imagine that he was like an astronaut. And so I realized at a young age, I may never become an astronaut, but I could become an aquanaut. And so my dad has always been the kind of father that enabled his children to do things, to touch things, to try things, whether it was a chainsaw, a shotgun, skill saw, working, driving motorcycles, whatever it was, he enabled us. And so he strapped that tank on me when I was 9 years old and tied a rope around my back and allowed me to go right off the back of our boat in the harbor, literally at the dock. And that was my first exposure at 9 years old to scuba diving. At 15 years old, I was now old enough to become certified, and I've been diving literally, with the exception of 2 years when I had some family issues going on. I've been diving every year ever since.
You were kind of brought into this group of divers that were doing things that wasn't common practice.
That is fair to say. So in 1980, I graduated high school. I moved back to New York, and I fell in with a group of older fellows, and they were doing dives that were way outside of the limit of sport diving. These were dives that were giving them the nickname the thugs or the crazies, because when dive boats would go out, these guys wanted to stay down longer or go deeper. To give you an idea, at that time, the sport diving limit in 1980, which was widely accepted, was 130 feet. And this group was regularly diving deeper than 200 feet. And the problem when you go deeper and breathe air is that you suffer something called narcosis, which is a debilitating effect that is akin to getting drunk. As you can probably imagine, when you've got a finite breathing supply and you're weaving yourself into broken ships, traveling inside them at great depth with the clock ticking, being drunk's not a good idea. But yet, with experience and patience and working your way up to it, these guys took me under their wing. They taught me how to use more advanced equipment, like looking at in these pictures, dry suits rather than wet suits. So we were adapting commercial technology and commercial diving equipment for sport diving. And we operated as a team. Although they were nicknamed the crazies or the thugs, we eventually adapted a much more respectable name, which was the Atlantic Wreck Divers. And when people question me and say, "Why were you going deep?" Well, the reality is that a lot of the shipwrecks that have been located off the New York and New Jersey shore in the 70s had already been dived extensively by the early divers in the 60s and 70s. So for us to find prized artifacts like ship's bells or portholes or crockery, we actually had to go further offshore and deeper. There's many experiences you can have diving, whether you love the interaction of marine life, just the feeling of weightlessness. But I have to tell you that of all of the experiences, one of the things that to this day keeps me diving is that feeling when you go down the anchor line and you know for a fact you're the first person to see this ship. You're the first one that has found something that has been lost. And all shipwrecks that are naturally occurring, meaning not the ones that are sunk on purpose, they're surrounding drama and tragedy. You know, a shipwreck by its very nature is a tragic event. And quite often there's great loss of life. And each one of these stories is a unique dive into the past, whether it's a ship that was sunk in an act of war, a collision, or a storm. When you're pulling yourself down that anchor line and you see it, that whole story plays out right in front of your mind. When you're decompressing and coming back up, it plays over and over in your mind's eye. And all you want to do is get back.
And let me ask you about going down that anchor line, because, again, this is the 1990s. GPS was just getting started at the time.
Didn't exist. Now, we were using Loran A and Loran C.
And getting to wrecks that hadn't been located yet. The beginning of Shadow Divers, which that's this book right here. The link is in the description below the video. They talk about kind of like a clandestine meeting. Bill Nagel, who built the Seeker, all of this stuff was kind of kept secret. Isn't that correct?
Yeah, Bill ran a commercial dive boat, which basically means that he was making a living taking scuba divers to shipwrecks. And so if he was able to steal customers away from other dive boats by telling them, hey, I've got this new shipwreck, he basically traded numbers or locations for an inshore shipwreck with a fisherman for this offshore virgin shipwreck. So that trade with a gentleman named Keatts is the impetus for this entire adventure. And some of the people, it wasn't about artifacts. For some of the people, it might be just to go and take pictures and be somewhere that no one else has ever been. For some of the people, it was about collecting lobsters or scallops or shooting fish. So every diver had a different reason, but everybody loved the opportunity to go to the path less traveled. And again, it was becoming in the 90s rarer to have that experience because we were kind of limited to a depth of about 200 or 250 feet by the equipment and the technology that we were using back then. And so without being able to go any deeper, we've kind of hit a wall, and that wall was a depth limit of how far we could go. And the submarine that is the subject of the book Shadow Divers was literally dangling on that edge of where it was safe to dive and where air becomes poisonous. And you can either die of carbon dioxide poisoning, oxygen poisoning, or you can do something stupid because you're suffering from nitrogen narcosis. So it's the very gas that you need to survive at the same way can kill you.
When you were invited to join up on these trips to dive on and try and figure out what it was, because you had said at the time John Chatterton thought he had seen a torpedo, but you said there was also maybe a little bit of narcosis going on. What did you think it was?
At the time, I didn't doubt John that it was a submarine, but John believed it was a World War II U-boat. And there were no U-boats listed as being sunk off the coast of New Jersey. But there was an American submarine that was lost. It was being towed from Philadelphia up to Maine, and it broke its tow and sank in bad weather. And so I was being a little pragmatic and thinking, well, if you think it's a submarine, well, there's an American submarine that had been lost, and it must be that submarine. And so when I went diving the wreck on that third trip after Steve Feldman had died, and that's actually me on my first dive, I was looking to find an artifact, and I'm actually holding an artifact in my hand there, that would have American writing on it. I was just looking for anything that said made in Chicago, anything like that, which would conclusively prove that this was a World War II American submarine that had been lost. But on that very dive, in the after compartment of the submarine, and I'm holding to be a canteen, John Chatterton was entering the forward end of the submarine, and he found some crockery. This occurred on the second dive of the day, and the weather had been very rough. And only 2 divers made that second dive that day, myself and John Chatterton. And so as I ascended up the line, John Chatterton was above me, and I could see in his mesh bag that he had found some crockery. I could see the white bowls, the bone white china. I ascended a little bit, and I, to this day, still recall how incredibly excited I was when I spun the bag around and I saw exactly what you have on screen. I saw the eagle and the swastika with the year 1942, and I was totally electrified. I'm like, what is this? This doesn't make sense. This is not supposed to be here. And it started a fever to be the men to identify it, because it was truly an enigma. At the conclusion of that dive, we all went home. We all went to our libraries and started saying, well, how did this submarine, fall through the cracks? How did a Nazi U-boat wind up off of Atlantic City, New Jersey, and no one knows? So over that winter of 91, 92, we reached out to different experts. We contacted the U.S. Navy. We contacted the German Navy, their naval attaché based in New York City. And we came away with the fact that neither the United States government, federal German government, no historian, and no expert, none of the authors that we could contact that had written books on German U-boat operations could answer the simple question, what submarine was this and why was it off New Jersey? We would then spend literally the next 5 years of our lives and dedicate treasure and marriages, our youth, and our sanity to try and figure that out.
Were you married at the time?
I was, and when the first fatality occurred, I wasn't on the trip. But in the third year of diving the wreck, there was a father and son team, Chris and Chrissy Rouse, that had come out with us, and they were very accomplished divers. And Chrissy was the son. He was positive he was going to go in there and find something that would identify the wreck. And on one of his dives inside, he ran into trouble. I'm not going to dedicate too much time going into the effect of what happened, but he basically became pinned inside the wreck, and his father had to try and unbury him from the debris that had fallen on him. As I mentioned earlier, you only have a finite amount of breathing gas or air in your cylinders, and by the time they came out, they were dreadfully low on air. They had more complications. They lost the line, the anchor line, and they tried to make a free ascent. And it was just one bad thing after another happened to them until finally they made a decision to come to the surface. And as many of your viewers who may know something about scuba diving, you can't simply just come to the surface at these depths. You have to do something called decompression. If you don't do your decompression, if you come straight to the surface, you can suffer a malady that is called the bends, or decompression sickness, from coming up and not allowing the bubbles in your blood to dissipate through normal respiration over a period of time. And so the Rouses came right to the surface, and Chris, the father, made sure that we got his son on board the boat before he died, literally in mine and John Chatterton's arms on the back of the boat on the ladder as we were trying to carry him up. His son fought for hours, ultimately would die hours later at a hospital. He had been evacuated by Coast Guard helicopter, but you can't alleviate or get rid of that much decompression and not have an extreme detrimental effect, whether it would be paralysis, brain damage, or in the case of Chrissy, his young heart just could not handle the stress of what the decompression sickness had done to him. He passed. So after that, this wreck in 3 years took 3 divers. It started to stress my marriage. At the point, I had 2 small children, and my wife did not understand why I wasn't diving with my friends, the Atlantic wreck divers, and having fun. What was it about this Nazi submarine that had me under its spell? At the time, I had difficulty answering it. Now, 30 years later, I could look you in the eye and say, well, life gives us opportunities, and sometimes we don't recognize them for what they are at the moment. And this submarine was an opportunity for John and I to do something. At the beginning of this adventure, I just wanted another bit of memorabilia. I wanted another artifact. I wanted a dish with the swastika sticker to put with all the other artifacts that I had from shipwrecks in my earlier career. And what happened is my outlook changed, because inside this broken submarine, unlike any other shipwreck that I had dove before, you could clearly see the remains of the 56-man crew. And it was incredibly sobering. To give you an example, I had made many dives on the Andrea Doria, and there had been 50 fatalities on that, but you don't see the remains of the victims. They've been absorbed by the sea. But inside of the submarine, in the still water, the skeletal remains are still there. In some cases, with tattered bits of uniform or boots with a leg jutting out. And I don't know what it would say about me or my morality to be a person who would enter such a site and not be affected by it, when other people that I would talk to would go, well, they were Nazis, they were the enemy. And I understood that in 1945, I would have probably been on an American destroyer, and I would have dropped depth charges on them and killed them because they were the enemy. But in 1991 and 92, 93, 94, they were lost souls. They were soldiers who fought their battle, they died, and no one knew where they were or who they were. And that haunted me. It haunted me to think that these men somewhere in the world had family, whether it was mothers or fathers, most likely brothers, sisters, children, wives, that didn't know where they were and what happened to them. And so I felt a personal sense of responsibility to solving this mystery. And my wife didn't understand that. Not that she didn't understand the concept behind it. She didn't understand risking my life to do it. So that would create stress. I had a business at the time. And of course, when Bill Nagel would call me up, hey, the weather's looking good, I would take off work. I'd close my shop, because the good weather days that we could get out to the submarine were far and few. And of course, this was another area that would cause difficulty with me and my wife, and of course, my business associates and customers and stuff like that. But I felt compelled. There was no book, Shadow Divers. There was no Hitler's Lost Sub. There was no reward for doing this. There was just the feeling in my heart that this was the right thing to do.
When you first go down there on your first trip out there and you see features like this, and you already have an idea that it was an American submarine.
That's correct. The shape of it and the limited visibility, and with narcosis, you just kind of try to focus on small features, not the big picture. The big picture you put together over a series of dives, or you do it by collecting photographs like the ones you're showing right now. You take these photographs and you kind of piece them together, and then you compare them to historic photographs. But at the time that you're diving, we go into the water with preconceived notions, and we are hoping that our assumptions are correct. And on that third dive, as I ascended, I was still convinced it was an American submarine until I turned that bag around and I saw the dishes with the swastika, and I was totally floored. So,
how much time are you able to spend down there?
Back in 91, when we were diving air, we would stay down for a maximum of about 20 minutes, of which it would take you about 3 to 5 minutes to swim down. And then it would take you about 90 minutes to 2 hours to come back up and do your decompression. So you couldn't just swim back up. You had to spend about 90 minutes to 2 hours of these decompression stops to ascend safely to the surface. Yeah, these are all my images. That's an image inside the diesel motor room. If you look carefully, you're looking at a workbench in the center, and you can actually see a vise sitting on the workbench. And surrounding you are some of the fixtures that were part of the interior ventilation and exhaust system for the two diesel engines, which would be to the left of this photograph.
At this point, Shane, John, Connor, what questions do you guys have?
Yeah, I just had a quick one for Richie. Wow, very compelling story. I want to thank you for telling it as honestly as you are. Do you remember what part of the sub you saw first, that you came down upon from your descent?
I can, and it's an iconic image. Aft of the conning tower where the periscopes are, you can see that item sticking up right behind the brake. That was the mount for the 37 millimeter anti-aircraft gun. The anchor was tied into that high point on the wreck. When we're tying the boat to a shipwreck, we always seek out the highest point. And as you can see, right aft of the breakage, to the right of the damaged control room, you see this little device sticking up. Well, that was the mount for this 37 millimeter gun. And I came down and I looked at it, and at the time, I didn't know what it was. I had only dove one other German U-boat before, and that was a Type 7 that was off North Carolina. It doesn't look anything like this. Yes, it's a submarine, but they're totally different. I remember seeing all of these objects and committing them to memory. And as I mentioned earlier, one of the key points is to come away with photographs or video and then compare it to historical or construction photos. And that's how you can help make an ID of a shipwreck by its type or style.
You guys have been going down there. You're bringing back plates, you're bringing back items, you're bringing back stories. How long until the word really gets out that you guys are onto something?
Well, actually, when John Chatterton surfaced with the dishes, the boat's owner, Bill Nagel, called the Star Ledger, which is one of the largest newspapers in New Jersey, and told them that he had located a Nazi submarine. He did it because, number one, he knew that boat captains were going to be coming out to the wreck because the word got out after the second trip and there was a diving fatality when Stephen Thilman died. And so now the word was out that he had found a submarine. As I mentioned earlier, it was a competitive business running a dive boat. You wanted to have people come on your boat the same way that any other business wants to get all the patrons they can. And so he wanted to make sure that the word was out. Bill Nagel and the Seeker identified this as a Nazi U-boat. None of us were prepared for the response. It must have been a slow news day because it made the front page of the Star Ledger. All of a sudden, area newscasters came down, and Bill and John were on the local news that night. They stayed in touch with us for a few months, but when no identity was forthcoming, their attention waned. But they kind of stayed in touch with us as the years went by. One of the things that we did was we would reach out, primarily myself and John Chatterton, but there was a number of other people that did a lot of the groundwork, meaning going down to the National Archives, contacting historians, going to the U-505 Museum, a German U-boat that's in Chicago, Illinois, and looking at it to learn more about German U-boats. One of my contributions was to reach out to the Ministry of Defense in Scotland Yard concerning German radio transmissions. This was one of the things that we were trying to figure out was how did a U-boat get all the way to America and no one knows that? We had been told by other historians and archivists/experts that the Ministry of Defense and Scotland Yard basically holds all of the English records of their Enigma decrypts, basically eavesdropping and decrypting German radio messages. And so I became friends with a curator there, a gentleman named Robert Kopic. And this was before the internet, boys. We were operating with fax machines and letters. My first contact to Robert Kopic was a letter in the mail. And then he mailed me back. And then we did that for a while until we realized we could fax each other. So you can realize how slow the process was of getting information. But it truly created an international connection of people that were interested, much like you guys, in naval history, but their area was German U-boats. And we enlisted their aid, and they realized that we were the sharp end of the stick. Every one of them said the same thing to us. The answer's on the U-boat. Go find it. They pointed us in different directions and different ways. Some helped us. Some didn't bear any fruit. But one of the things about it that jokingly makes us detectives was the fact that we had to keep narrowing down the field. We were going to the wreck, finding items, finding objects, taking measurements, coming back, and using that to eliminate the possibilities of which submarine this could be. And as people who've read the book understand about the difficulty of going 60 miles offshore and 230 feet down, there were some seasons we only got 3 days out on the wreck. That's it. 3 days of a year. And so you had to make it count. And then you would come back and you would do your research and follow up with that. And so prior to actually finding a tag which identified the wreck, we had narrowed it down to 3 possibilities. It could only be one of these 3 U-boats. And that was based on information and data that we collected from the submarine.
Well, and let me jump to that because I consider it actually one of the creepier parts of the story. This is the handle of a steak knife with a sailor's name carved in it. And now all of a sudden you've got not just an item like a plate, but you actually have an item with a name. And as soon as this was brought out in the Nova documentary, it gives you chills because now all of a sudden here's a name. Was it you or John that discovered the knife?
It was John. John had recovered a box from the area of the officers' quarters. He wasn't looking for silverware. He was actually looking for the Kriegstagebuch, or KTB, which is basically the ship's log. Mm-hmm. And we had it on good authority that the ship's log was kept in a box adjacent to the captain's quarters. And he was hoping that this box would have that in it. But when he brought the box up, it was nothing more than cutlery, silverware, spoons and knives. And only one of those knives had a wooden handle. And you're looking at it, and it had the name Horenberg. And one of the divers on the trip that day slapped John on the back and said, "You've solved the mystery, John. All you have to do is find Horenberg, and now you know." And so that's exactly what we did. We wrote to the equivalent of the German Veterans Administration in Germany, which is called the VOST organization, and asked for any information. And now the problem is they were loath to give anything to anybody, even in America. I'm pretty sure you can't just go to the Veterans Administration and say, "Hey, tell me about Joe Blow." You know, they're not going to do that. So we had to enlist a little bit of aid from other archivists and historians that had some credibility. And then we were able to find out there was only one German sailor. Horenberg is a very uncommon name. And there was only one of the 40,000 men who served on German submarines. There was only one named Horenberg. And Horenberg served on a submarine that was sunk off Casablanca. And so our experts once again told us, well, the knife is a dead end. Maybe somebody stole the knife. Maybe at one point Horenberg was on this submarine. Who knows? But Horenberg and his boat are sunk off Casablanca. So that was a dead end.
At least that's what the records showed.
That is absolutely correct.
It was like Rabat or something like that. Correct. And you're approaching all these different people that might be able to provide some information. And one of the people that you approach is this guy.
Horst Bredow.
Right. And he was really dubious about what you guys were bringing to the table because, yeah, here's a knife. Horenberg's name is carved into it, but Horenberg went down off of Rabat, off the northwestern corner of Africa.
Absolutely correct. So the gentleman that's on screen right now runs an organization, he's passed, called the U-Boat Archive in Cuxhaven. And this is not a state or government funded organization. It is basically like our version of the U.S. Subvets, which is a private, veteran-run, veteran-funded organization. And it's important to note that post-World War II Germany, most Germans really would wish that everything that had to do with the Third Reich would just go away. And yet, Horst Bredow, who was a young man who survived, felt compelled to keep the memory of the U-boat sailors alive. And he created this repository for everything U-boat. And it's not just artifacts. Artifacts are a very small part of it. It is reams and reams of paper. It is logs. It is photographs. It is personal stories. It is diaries. It is some of the personal photographs that sailors took and sent home to their families, and then the families don't know what to do with them. And so he has collected them, and he's collected all of these images. And as you correctly said, when we told him about the knife, he said the knife is a dead end. Horenberg isn't on that submarine. Horenberg is off North Africa. And so you have to go back to the wreck. And that's exactly how he put it. You have to go back to the wreck. And that's exactly what we did.
Was he supportive, or was he kind of a jerk?
He was supportive, and I can forgive his, I don't say indifference, but you have to realize that, it's going to sound crazy, but you mention U-boats and all of a sudden the nuts come out of I don't know what it is about German submarines, but it just brings out a lot of crazy people. And what I mean by that is you've got people that are convinced that Hitler escaped to South America, that Nazi U-boats were loaded with gold and priceless art, and every U-boat is filled with gold, and it's just craziness. And I think that you guys have a great appreciation for military operations and the understanding of that. That's not to say that submarines didn't transport gold here or there, but there are people that believe every time a submarine's found that it was carrying Hitler and gold. Believe it or not, we actually thought that too at the beginning, because it's like, hey, submarine that nobody can explain. So we went through that little phase, and Horst Bredow had to deal with that on a regular basis. Crazy people pestering him or calling up with phantom U-boat stories, until we were able to literally show him video, which we did, and bring artifacts to him from the U-boat itself. Then he realized that, hey, these guys really do have a mystery, and he did everything he could to assist us. But as John so eloquently says in the book Shadow Divers, he had spent a week in Germany and met with Horst Bredow. I could not accompany him on that first trip. And Horst Bredow slid across the table a piece of paper with the number of 5 different U-boats. And he said, it has to be one of these U-boats. John looked at the list, and he wrote me a postcard and sent it to me from Germany. I still have it to this day. And it says, we know more about our U-boat than they do. It couldn't possibly have been any of the U-boats that Horst Bredow had said it was. He was believing it was one of the U-boats that had been lost and sunk off America, but that the U.S. Navy had made a mistake of its location by hundreds of miles. That made a simpler answer. Kind of like the way I approached it, and I said, hey, look, there's an American submarine in the area. It must be an American submarine. I think Horst Bredow looked at it and goes, hey, there's 5 U-boats lost off the East Coast. It's got to be one of these. And so it was, I think, an oversimplification.
How long until these guys get involved? You know, none of us would have really even known the story, or you wouldn't have even really come into the mainstream.
Not at all.
You've got Nagel going to the papers, and of course that makes big news, but it kind of almost still stays in maybe not the local community, but it's not widespread. And until the Nova documentary came out, Shane, what did you know about this story? Were you familiar with this before we had Richie on tonight?
I am absolutely coming at it completely virgin.
Okay. You weren't familiar with it. Was it the documentary, John, that you had first heard about?
No, actually. In middle school, I just went to Barnes & Noble, and I would always go to the World War II section, and one day I picked up Shadow Divers and read it. This would be about 2006, 2007. I still have my copy on my bookshelf right next to me.
I know Connor wasn't familiar with it. He's a lot younger, but
I actually have seen the Nova documentary, so I am somewhat familiar with the story.
I saw it when it first came out. I want to say that was November of 2000, correct?
Oh, yeah. But how did they get involved? So it's a crazy story. While we're working on the U-boat, the brand new internet came out. And I mean, it was like brand new. I had since been divorced from my wife and I was now dating. And a girl I was seeing at the time brought me a story and she said, hey, look, I saw this on the internet. They're going to recover a German U-boat from Boston Harbor. And I'm like, this is a crock of bull. What are you talking about? She says, look, it's a PBS Nova. They're going to make a special out of it.
Hi, my name is Kirk Wolfinger, and I am a filmmaker, producer, director for 40 years and over 200 and some hours of film that deal with all topics from U-boats to the Holocaust to astronauts. You name it, I've probably made a film about it. And since 1990, I've done 30 Novas.
So I actually cold called WGBH television studio here in Boston and said, hey, I read an article that you guys are supporting endeavor to salvage a U-boat in Boston Harbor.
Nova had asked me to do a film about U-boats. I would do people who do deep diving. I would do people who fly airplanes. I would do the deck of an aircraft carrier. I would do submarines. I've done all the boys and their toys subjects for many years for Nova.
And they put me in touch with a woman named Lauren Aguirre. She was a science editor. And I asked the same question. And she says, yes, we are working with, and she mentioned their names.
There's some wacko guy who says he has a U-boat. And so I contact this guy. And right from the get-go, I'm thinking.
And I said to her, it's a bullshit story. There's no U-boat in Boston Harbor. And you can hear the phone get silent for a minute.
This guy, he's pretty seedy. Oh, yeah, I got a U-boat. It's blah, blah, blah.
Listen, Boston Harbor is not even 100 foot deep anywhere, okay? Let's start with that. And if you think a German U-boat would actually come into Boston Harbor and then be sunk or scuttle itself and nobody would know about it except this guy.
So I'm like thinking, So I do a little investigation. I find out, indeed, this guy has been selling U-boats like other guys have sold the Brooklyn Bridge. It's like, yeah, just give me the money. Give me $25,000 and I'll go out and we'll do this. Well, he had done that to Nova. And then Nova asked me to vet him.
And let's just say your story is true. Do you really think the German government is going to allow someone to pick up a war grave, scrape out the German sailors, and make a museum out of it? This is a bullshit story.
So I vetted him. And I concluded, I don't think so.
She goes, well, what makes you an expert? And I said, well, I found one. We're working on one.
In the meantime, I get this email. Was it email? It was 1989. Was it email? No. Yeah, it was 94, 95. I get an email from some guy who says, hey, I heard you're looking for a U-boat. I got a U-boat. And I'm like, yeah, okay, another crackpot. He said, no. I'll show you some pictures.
So I had to, with my handy fax machine, fax a couple of pages from the Star Ledger newspaper articles. And she called me back and says, can you come into Boston?
And he sent me some pictures of artifacts. And I said to Paula, this guy actually sounds like he's got a U-boat. The other guy, I think he's a shyster.
Did you at any time meet with Paula Apsel?
Absolutely. Paula was the woman. She was the head at that time. She's since, I believe, retired. She's a wonderful woman, wonderful person, strong person.
So we arranged to meet Paula. Richie's going to drive up from New Jersey. I was going to drive down from Maine to Boston and meet.
That night, I called John. I said, John, I need to borrow your dish with the eagle and swastika and a couple of videotapes of the wreck. And he goes, why? I go, well, I'm going to go to Boston.
So we go into Paula's office.
My name is Paula Apsel, and I'm a filmmaker and a journalist. For 35 years, I was senior executive producer of the PBS science series Nova, and I made several Nova episodes myself.
Since 1990, I've done 30 Novas. And sometimes she comes to me and says, there's this guy who has this U-boat, or there's this guy who can get us access to an aircraft carrier, or there's this guy, blah, blah, blah. I want you to do this.
In the back corner was a gentleman that I didn't know at the time. I would later find out he was a producer who we would work with, a gentleman named Kirk Wolfinger.
So Richie starts to do his thing. And he looks like some mook from New Jersey. Sounds like some mook from New Jersey. Like, I got this U-boat, my partner and I, we got this thing. And I'm going like, oh boy, this is not going to go well. And I can tell Paula's kind of like, oh, what did I get into here?
She was pointing at me like, trying to pick apart my story to see if I was, one of the crazies that come out when you say U-boat.
It was up to Richie to make the sale, and I was listening too, going like, do I believe this guy? Is the BS meter going off?
I had video of a shipwreck. I was telling them the location. I had given them the past 3 years of work that we had been doing. I told them the names of all of the experts we were working. I had prepared all of this.
And then he opens up this little suitcase and he starts to pull stuff out. And he pulls out a saucer and he flips it over, and on the back is the eagle and the swastika, 1942.
One thing led to another, and I literally shocked them.
Paul is very Jewish, and the thought of Nazis makes her skin crawl.
Most of my team is not Jewish. In fact, I think I'm the only Jewish person. And it's tough.
I'll never forget how mortified she was when I laid the dish on her desk.
She literally physically recoiled when he turned it over and showed her the eagle and the swastika. She literally physically went, ooh, like she was looking at a snake.
It wasn't just that the Germans wanted to kill the Jews. Killing them is one thing. They wanted to humiliate them and dehumanize them.
They make my skin crawl, but oh my God, I want to touch it.
And you could see her with her finger. She wanted to touch it, and yet at the same time, I think as a Jewish woman, mortified, horrified by the physicality of this swastika I had placed on her desk. But she had to touch it, and she could almost feel the electricity that was jumping from this dish, the negative energy, if you will. And it was palatable in the room.
And Paula looks at me and she says, we're doing this, right? Yeah, there you go.
That's another thing about when you go in and you deal with TV types, you don't realize that in a way it's kind of like an audition. You don't know you're being auditioned, but they're looking at you.
It was an audition because, when I'm doing a film, the subject, of course, is very important, but who's the protagonist? Who's the person going to look?
They're listening to you and they like your animation. They love your energy. And I had all of that.
And in the case of Richie and John, as I have come to learn over the 25 years we've known each other, they're great characters.
Some of them come to us and fall into the app. The others are well planned. Some of them we have to raise money for because they're very expensive to do. But all of them have elements that are kind of surprises that you don't expect.
He told me years later, he said, you had it right then and there. When she saw that dish and she just felt like, oh, we have to have this story. We have to do it. And they did. They worked with us. And the only thing that we really asked of them was to help pay the fuel.
Every Nova at that time and most shows have a development deal. So they'll give you not a significant amount of money, but, enough money to pay your bills and pay yourself to spend, a month investigating a story.
After the first 3 years, nobody wanted to go there anymore. I mean, there were many trips where it was literally John and I, just John and I on the boat, paying the fuel to get the boat all the way out there. So asking Nova to help come up with the fuel, and we were the ones shooting all the underwater video.
If you don't come back with anything because there's just nothing there, it's like, okay, well, we didn't spend all that much money. But once I say to Richie, hey, I got money, I'm going to go do this. Now you're exclusive to me. You can't be shopping this anywhere else.
And they came out for one summer. We were no closer to identifying it. And then they were out with us again. And that's when we had gotten a clue on how to solve the mystery.
Now, remember, they had done 4 years of diving without us, but before any movie was getting made. And they'd said, this summer, we're going to positively identify this thing. We think we know what boat it is, but this year we're going to put the hook on it. And so we probably went out 5-6 times.
It was interesting. We had never worked with television crews. And many of them had never been on a 60-foot boat for 24 hours, 60 miles offshore. And many of them were just totally seasick.
It is 65 miles off New Jersey, and you're in a 60-foot dive boat with about 12 other people, so there's no room to move around until the divers get in the water. And it's the Atlantic Ocean, so more than likely you're in 3-foot, 4-foot swells.
I mean, some of them wanted to be against the gunnel, and sick as a dog.
It's usually when you're moored over the wreck, that's when you get sick. The boat's on the anchor line, and it's just swinging around and swinging her up and down and up and down.
And yet, when it was time to work, they would literally get up out of the scuppers and grab the boom and do what they had to do. But it was just interesting to see how hardcore these guys were to get the shot.
And remember, you're looking through a camera. Adds to the inducement to vomit.
Fortunately, Kirk Wolfinger has got a lot of experience on boats, having done a lot of different water programs. So he never had a problem.
Once or twice, I was fine. 2 or 3 times, I was violently ill. I've been on dive boats 50, 60 times. Half the time I'll be sick as a dog, and half the time I'm not affected. For me, the second we started to turn around and go back in, which took about 6.5 hours, I was fine.
You've got them out there. Horse Bredow tells you to go back. You've got the wrong sub. Go back and get some more information. The fact that you got a guy's name carved into a knife, it's not good enough, because the guy that had carved his name into it actually went down off of Rabat, northwest coast of Africa. So you got to go back to the drawing board and you pull up this.
Well, there's a little bit more of a backstory to that. So what you're looking at is a spare parts box. The front half of the submarine is where most of the crew lived and most of the crew worked. So the front half of the submarine consisted of the control room, which is that destroyed, damaged area, the epicenter of an explosion. Forward of that would have been the petty officers and officers' quarters, and then in front of that would have been the forward torpedo room, which most of the enlisted men would live in. And so we had been focusing a lot of our work there. If you went to the back or the after part of the submarine, you would immediately hit the diesel motor room. And then the path going into the electric motor room was blocked by debris. We could never get into the electric motor room. But the electric motor room was just that. It was a room filled with 2 electric motors for operating the submarine underwater. And so no bunks in there, no crew spaces. It was just a machinery room. So we didn't really want to get in there for any reason. We didn't think that there was any reason to get in there. And then I was thumbing through one of my many books, a book by Hank Keatts. It's called U-Boats. And in it is a photograph of a Bakelite or plastic tag that had a U-boat number on it. And it had, I believe it was the U-853. And I'm like, wow, if we found that, that'd be awesome. So I called the author of the book, Hank Keatts. I'm like, Hank, where does this tag come from? I know it's from the U-853, which is a German submarine sunk off Rhode Island, but whose picture is that? Where did this come from? And he says, well, there's this guy, Billy Palmer. I go, I know Billy Palmer. He goes, yeah, Billy Palmer got it. Hang up on Keatts. I call up Billy Palmer. I'm like, Billy, where did you get this tag? He goes, what tag? I'm like, in Hank Keatts' book, there's a tag. It says U-853. Where did you find it? He goes, oh, in the electric motor room. There's dozens of them. I'm like, what do you mean there's dozens of them? He goes, well, on all of these boxes of spare parts, there would be the U-boat number and also what was in the box. And so now I'm questioning, I'm like, well, why would they put the U-boat number on a spare parts box? Because when they would return from a cruise and they had used parts, the chief engineer would then send the boxes off to be refilled with bushings, bearings, wire, whatever, fuses, whatever it was that they need. And then being German, that box had a number 37, and it had to go back on board the ship in exactly the right location. So all of these boxes were on a master sheet for the chief engineer so that if he needed a fuse, he knew exactly what box, where the box was stored, and that's why they had these tags. And so I'm like, God damn it. I call up Chatterton, and a plan is now hatched. We've got to get into the electric motor room. Well, easier said than done. There was a reason why we hadn't gotten into the electric motor room before, and that's because it was being blocked by the escape trunk that used to sit in between the 2 engines. And we used a crowbar to pry it out of the way, and we thought, all right, now the path is clear. We can now get into the electric motor room. So now we were able to get back another 5 feet, and then we saw a huge oil tank. What you're looking at is you're looking aft, and there is the port engine and the starboard engine, and in between them, you can see that round cylinder. That was the escape trunk that was wedged right in front. I crowbarred that thing out of the way, and it fell in between the two engines, fortunately not on me. And now you can see that there is the daily fuel tank. So basically, the way that German submarines operated is every day the engineer would pump fuel from the bunkers into that fuel tank. It would go through a series of filters, and then that would gravity feed the two engines on the surface. So that is a fuel tank, a diesel fuel tank that was strapped or bolted to the top of the compartment that has now fallen. And it totally restricted our swim into the electric motor room. So that's where John came up with this crazy plan to take off his tanks, to swim over the obstruction and get into the electric motor room and recover a box like the one that I was holding. And that box now had on it a small tag. The way that I found out what it said was John and I were decompressing, and we had sent that box up, floated up in a lift bag like a balloon. Another dive team on the boat, those guys opened the bag and they looked at it, and the shot that you're looking at is exactly what they saw. And so one of our dive team, a gentleman named Will Macbeth, swam down to us while we're decompressing, and on a slate he had written, "The Yoo-Hoo now has a name. It's U-869. And John and I just looked at each other and we shook our hands. It's like, we're done. We did it.
I was not there for that. I think 30 years later, it's okay to admit that. They found it. I think they'd gone out with just like 3 of them. They were like, fuck, we're just going to solve this thing, you know? And it was getting late in the season. And they knew where they needed to get, and they just went. They didn't even tell us. So I get a call. And it's Richie or John. I can't remember which. And he goes, "We got the box. We got the tag. We know what it is." And I said, "Don't touch it." He said, "Well, it's in my garage right now." He said, "But it's in water. It's still in the bag. And we haven't scraped any of the stuff off." And I said, because he said, "I figured you would want to get that." I said, "Thank you very much." So the next day, a couple of us jumped in a car, ran down there, got on a boat with a bunch of the divers, including John and Richie, and that box still in the net they sent it up in. Went 10 miles offshore so that you couldn't see land. They got in the water, and then they brought it up as if we were on the dive. And they got it on the deck, and that was real. And they scraped it off, and that was all real. That was like it U-869. So that discovery was honest, but we weren't there when they pulled it off the bottom. But we were there when they actually pulled the tag off and went, "It's U-869.
And that tag positively identified the submarine as the U-869. There was no backslaps. There was a sense of relief. And of course, Paula was ecstatic because almost on camera, we identified the submarine. And you can see it right there. We just cleaned it with our fingers. That tag also proved that the U-boat was not sunk off North Africa, but that it had come to New York. All of a sudden, the story just fell into place. U-869 and Commander Neuerberg was originally ordered to operate off of New York and New Jersey, but he had taken so much time transiting around the Faroes, avoiding enemy air patrols and offensive hunter-killer groups, that he burned too much fuel in the eyes of the German high command. So they sent a radio message, which was never acknowledged. And it was only after putting things together that we were able to realize that U-869 and Commander Neuerberg missed the radio signal ordering them to go to North Africa. And now we could be 100% proof positive when we would knock on someone's door and not tell them what they knew. They knew that in 1945, their father, their brother, their husband did not come home. What we were able to do was we were able to tell them, what had happened to them, where they fell, and that the people that found them treated them with respect. Because we were working with Der Spiegel in Germany and with obviously WGBH here in America, we had an agreement to withhold the information in Germany and allowed Der Spiegel to find as many of the family members as possible. They did not want the family members to hear about it on the news. They wanted them to be notified by Der Spiegel, and then if they were willing, then to be interviewed or meet us, the divers. Obviously, Horst Bredow fell into that too. He had no idea. And so his moment that he says, it cannot be, that's a real TV moment, brother. And it was nice because I had made a commitment. Even if Nova wanted us to do it, I could never sit in the living room of a family member and go, I'm pretty sure I found your brother's boat. It had to be proof positive. You can't just go into someone's home and not be 100% proof positive. You can't do that, because what happens when it's wrong? I knew that if we never, ever found those tags, I would never go to anyone's house. You can see that we actually have the box, the tag. We have one of the artifacts. That white piece of aluminum is a schematic for the interior ventilation system of the submarine. And in one corner, it said Type 9C, and then it said Deschemeg Bremen. And that was another artifact that helped us narrow down the field. It told us that that submarine was built at the Deschemeg factory in Bremen, Germany. It narrowed down the field to only U-boats that meet our criteria that had been built by that factory.
Who else is in here in the picture with you? I see John Chatterton, and I see you, and I see Horst. Who are the other two guys?
Standing directly next to me is Kirk Wolfinger. And right behind Horst Bredow is Rush Denoyer, who was the writer and the producer behind telling the story and dealing with Paula and making the story what Paula would call a nova.
You had initially expressed a belief that it could have been an American submarine. What submarine was that, and has that one been found since, or is that one still missing?
It was the USS Spikefish. It was an American submarine that was decommissioned and being towed for scrap, and wound up being located by members of the Atlantic Wreck Divers off of eastern Long Island, New York, roughly about 60 miles maybe from this U-boat. It's in the vicinity. So I believed it was the USS Spikefish. There's still controversy about this. At the time of our research, we had gone to the U.S. Navy, U.S. Naval Weapons Station Earl. We went to the Philadelphia Navy Yard. We also went down to Carter Explosives down in Maryland and showed them video of the wreck. And they were the ones that said that the damage that we're seeing here is commensurate with a torpedo, how the conning tower is on its side. To them, it seemed like it was a torpedo. One of the people at Naval Weapons Earl had mentioned to us that a number of U.S. submarines had circular run torpedoes. One of them, the USS Tang, had sunk because of its own torpedo in the Formosa Strait. We're like, well, if you're telling us this looks like torpedo damage, then that's it. And so that was the working theory for many years. And then somebody came forward and said that the wreck had been depth charged by a U.S. Coast Guard cutter and an American destroyer in late February or March 1945. So we interviewed Captain Judson, who is the captain of the U.S. Navy ship, and he said that, yes, they did depth charge target, but it acted like a wreck. It didn't move, and there was no preponderance of debris, no oil came up. And so the discrepancy is, how do you blow a submarine in half and nothing comes up? John Chatterton and I seem to believe that the submarine may have already been dead, filled with water. Everything that would have floated away. The oil would have floated away because both the USS Kohler and the Crow stopped a series of depth charges, but they did not find any debris, no bodies, no wood, no oil, nothing. So with nothing coming to the surface, they declared it just a shipwreck and sailed away. And so a couple of years after we had positively identified the wreck, the NOVA program had come out, shadow divers had come out, the U.S. Coast Guard claims that it killed the U-869, despite the fact that the U.S. Navy believed that it was a wreck. And so it's subjective. I wasn't there. I don't know. I know that there's definitely depth charge damage in the stern, where you can see that the hull is bent in and pressed down from an outward force. You can kind of see it in that drawing above the after torpedo room. You can see that it's bent in, and it's clearly depth charge damage. But the center part of the submarine is blown outward, which the experts at Carter Oxford that was indicative of an explosion. Now another person has just come out, a gentleman named Hamilton has written a book and said that there's a possibility it was a hydrogen explosion because of built up gases that occurred when U-boats were snorkeling, and that there's evidence of this having occurred in the English Channel with German U-boats. So now there's three different theories: whether she killed herself with her own torpedo firing it on target, she was sunk by the Kohler and Crow, American destroyer and a Coast Guard cutter, or she blew herself up with an internal explosion and then was laying dead on the seafloor until the Kohler and Crow ran over it as an anomaly and depth charged it. The thing is that they did not have movement. They just ran over a metal target and they depth charged it, which happens to a lot of shipwrecks during World War II. A lot of the shipwrecks that we dive have been blown to pieces because they weren't taking any chances. So I don't have the answer. That's not where my area of expertise would lay to tell you how she died. I can only tell you how we treated it and how we identified it.
Well, before we logged on tonight and went live, you caught John and I and Connor kind of talking about
my crazy theory.
Well, the theories, because he had the action reports from the Kohler.
So yeah, the war diaries are available, and the Kohler and the Crow were sitting outside New York City about to start a convoy on February 11th, 45, and they got called to go attack a sonar contact, and you can read all in the war diaries. They're dropping depth charges for hours on this target. And when you plot the coordinates of the Crow for 8 p.m. on the 11th, it's 12 or 15 miles away from the wreck. So my theory, and this is just rereading this book and then just coming up with this, is that this sub fired her acoustic torpedo at this convoy that was forming up. It circled back and hit the sub. They sank. And then the two destroyer escorts got the contact, went and depth charged a wreck. Because in the war diary it says hours of depth charge attacks classified as non-sub, which you could say, well, they're hitting a wreck. So that's my theory right now. Who knows?
It's as good as any other, my friend.
Yeah.
Well, I know you said that, these are all just theories and that you're not the expert, but in this story, I can't think of anybody else who would be more qualified to throw their opinion into the ring. So what do you think happened?
One of the things I love to say, which has been my guiding force in diving shipwrecks, is let the wreck tell you what happened. And that's whether or not I'm trying to find an artifact or an answer of the events that occurred. In this particular instance, I've dove a number of German U-boats. And I challenge you guys to look up images of other sunken U-boats, whether it's the U-853, which was depth charged constantly for 2 days. 2 days. And it's 100 feet shallower. It's in 130 foot of water. Its conning tower is up, and there's no massive explosion. They literally blew the 853 up until the captain's hat floated up. They literally recovered the German commander's hat from the water. They recovered bodies. They recovered items, cloth, furniture, and still the submarine remains contiguous. It's intact. There's holes punched into it, but it's not split open like a can that somebody put in an M80 in.
Yeah, we were just talking about this a month ago. And John, you said that the Slater Museum has what from the 853?
Yeah, at the museum, we have the life raft, some of the debris, and the hat that floated to the surface. It's on display.
And they sent a diver down. There was unexploded depth charges and hedgehogs everywhere.
Yep.
And he recovered one body that was blocking the conning tower, He opened the hatch and pulled out a body, and that sailor is buried in Newport, Rhode Island. And it says Ein Bekannter, one unknown German sailor. And that was recovered by a U.S. Navy diver. And the key here is to answer your question is that particular submarine is not blown into pieces. And if you look at the U-701, which was sunk by aerial bomb off the Hatteras, it's remarkably intact. If you look at the U-352, which was sunk by massive depth charging, or the U-85, which was also sunk by depth charging and killed its entire crew, they're all intact. They're all one continuous submarine with small punches of depth charge damage. So I don't have an answer for you. I always like using experts to tell me what they think. And I'm not an explosives expert. That's why I mentioned that we went to Carterock. We went to Naval Weapons Earl, Philadelphia Navy Yard. We spoke with explosive experts. They were the ones that said, this is what it looks like. And we've even had some computer modeling done to say, could a depth charge create this damage? And the only way that it could happen is if the depth charge exploded inside the submarine.
Because some of the framework was blasted outward.
That's correct.
Now, I definitely want to get your thoughts on artifact recovery, the controversy of artifact recovery. Some people say you shouldn't be touching this stuff. Other people, like me, for example, I can appreciate if it's a war grave, but if you hadn't brought this stuff to the surface, you never would have identified the submarine. So what is your line of thinking there? Since
we're talking about U-869, I'm going to focus on that. John Chatterton and I recovered various objects from the wreck in an effort to, number one, identify it, but along the way, we had to narrow down the field. And people say to me, well, why were you recovering crockery? If you look at the crockery, you'll actually notice that the Germans put the year on the crockery. It says 1942. And we actually found crockery with the year 1944. So we knew that the wreck could not have sank before 1944. So the recovery of crockery was one of many clues that helped us narrow down the field.
Richie, the Atlantic wreck diver, who dove on the Andrea Doria and all that stuff, he was a pirate. And he would take plates and portholes and everything else. That is not Richie today. And it wasn't even Richie when he was diving on the U-869.
We had been told by Horst Bredauer and other people that some members of the crew would write their name on their boots. So we started recovering boots. But then we felt that that was way too personal, so we stopped. We only recovered actually one boot. There was no name on it. And then we realized that there's quite a possibility that someone was wearing those boots. So we stopped that. So every artifact that we recover was in an effort to keep narrowing it down.
Richie and John had a dilemma, and that was they went to the United States Navy and they said, hey, we found a U-boat 65 miles off New Jersey. And the Navy said, we didn't sink it. And went to the Germans, and Germans said, we didn't lose it. So they have this U-boat. They know it's a U-boat, but nobody's claiming it. So they pulled artifacts specifically to be able to identify it.
John recovered an escape lung, which basically looks like a life preserver, but an escape lung is a device for submariners. They can breathe off of it. It looks like a life preserver, and they can escape from a sunken submarine and come to the surface. That escape lung that John recovered is unique in that John brought the air cylinder, the oxygen cylinder that was attached to it, back to his house and put it in his garage. And overnight, as it dried, it blew up. He didn't realize that it still had pressure in it and that it had been so fatigued from 70 years underwater that it split in two and exploded and blew up his garage. And when I mean blew up, I mean it blew things off the shelf and, knocked things down. But at the same time, it knocked off the incrustation. And on the shoulder of it, you could clearly see a manufacturer hydrostatic date. And that date was November of 1944. So that we knew that this had to be a late war U-boat.
The Germans were never in love with the idea of it, but they couldn't refuse because they couldn't claim that they knew what it was. And that's why Richie pulled artifacts.
This was one of the last U-boats most likely to sortie. It could have been one of the U-boats that was against Operation Teardrop that had been sent to operate against the United States, or particularly New York. So these were incredible clues.
The Germans were saying, well, it's not our U-boat, but if it is, you got to keep your hands off it. And they went, well, hold it. It's either your U-boat or it's not. So if it's not your U-boat, then you don't care. You can't identify it. We want to identify it for the sake of the men who served on board.
The recovery of objects like the Hornberg knife was no longer important to us from the collection of them. It became important to the story. And once we recovered the tag with the identifying mark of the U-869, we never recovered anything again.
They knew when they entered the U-869, they could see the bones. They knew that this was a ship on which people had died. There was a whole, in the control room, it's littered with bones.
Not only that, every family member that I met would invariably ask for me to bring things to the wreck. They didn't ask me to go get anything, but I would offer them. So whether it was crockery, I did give some of the family members artifacts from the wreck as a memento or a memory of their brother or their loved one. We gave artifacts to the U-boat archive, as you saw, because that was the proper place to put them. And that was it. That ended taking objects from the U-boat. So the purpose of recovering objects was so that we could identify the submarine and identify the men. And that was it.
They didn't pull artifacts because they were treasure hunting. Richie is today very much against that kind of thing. In general, I am very much of the school of thought that if you got a shipwreck where people have died, I don't think there's anything wrong with photographing it, exploring it, but you don't touch stuff and bring it back.
Now, when you talk about the big picture of artifact recovery, there's laws in effect. If a shipwreck is a war grave, if it's a naval vessel that sank, regardless of the reason, it's considered a war grave, and the only people that can recover anything from it is their government. And so you can visit American warships, but you can't take anything except pictures. If you're in English waters and you're diving British submarines or British shipwrecks, the same rules apply, no matter where you are in the world. Now, one of the things that's unusual with U-boats is that although thankfully the Third Reich is defunct and gone, the war graves of their German sailors from World War I and World War II is now in effect the property and under the guardianship of the current German government. And the same way that the CS Hunley, the Confederate submarine Hunley, is now under the protection of the United States government, their sworn enemy. But that's who is protecting the wreck. They recovered the wreck. They removed and interred the remains of the Confederate sailors on board. So military wrecks have a very special status, and only the surviving government or the government that is responsible for them can do any recovery. Merchant vessels are a whole other kettle of fish. There's now policies called UNESCO, which is governing the control of shipwrecks throughout the world. Most of the members of the United Nations signed on to UNESCO, which basically says any shipwreck that's over 100 years old is historic no matter where it is, no matter what it is, and therefore it shouldn't be violated. Shipwrecks that are in state waters are protected by the state. Shipwrecks that are in international waters, you can recover things from them if they are truly abandoned in international waters. And then, as you guys know, the shipwrecks of the Great Lakes are protected because they are not international waters, they're state waters. And so they fall under state protection. And there are places in the world like Truk Lagoon in Micronesia, where the Micronesian government has protected all of the Japanese shipwrecks in the lagoon, and it is a diving mecca. People go there. There's war wrecks in other areas that are protected by government agencies, whether there's civilian wrecks or not. So it depends where you are in the world, whether or not it is lawful to recover objects from shipwrecks. When I was a kid, it was the Wild West. If there were laws, nobody knew about them. And then over the last 40 years, not only have the laws been enacted and enforced, but they've been clarified and they've been expanded upon. And so today's shipwreck divers, most of them don't recover artifacts. Most of them visit the shipwreck to swim through history, to get dinner if they are so inclined, and to take pictures.
One of the viewers, Divers Down, asked the question, have you been back? And of course, the answer's Yes, because you gave me a video that you shot from 2020.
You're now going into the radio room, sonar room. The interior walls are all down. I'm going to duck under this harness. And that's the doorway now leaving the officers' quarters and heading in through the galley. The reason why the film cut is because I don't film human remains. Having become really good friends with many of the families, I edit out any human remains. And you're now in the forward torpedo room. And to your immediate right, you're looking at the remains of a torpedo. Those are pieces of linoleum that at one point lined all of the bulkheads.
Linoleum.
Yep. You're gonna over and you can see the aft end of a torpedo right there.
And the torpedo has a hole in it?
Yeah, those are rot holes. There's a view from outside the wreck. That's actually like the view that John had when he first dove the wreck. When he looked in the open torpedo hatch, he looked down, and that's what you can see. I actually shot that picture from the same perspective to give people an idea of what John saw. He thought it was a torpedo, but he wasn't sure. And the reason it has that metal ring around it is to protect the counter-rotating propeller. That is not kept on when they fire it. That's just for storage purposes, so that no one could damage or ding the propellers. All of the interior woodwork, all of the paneling is gone. That's the remains of the toilet, the forward head, if you will. Swimming forward now in the foreground, you can see a yellow life raft. There's a lot of that around. You're going to see some cooking pots. And the rails, those are the rails that they would use to load the torpedo tubes. You're going to notice that all of a sudden the silt is building up. That is a light fixture that's just dropped straight down. I'm pushing forward now, and I'm really getting belly into the silt so that I can get as close as I can. And you can make out the two uppermost torpedo tubes. And now as I turn around, you'll get an idea of what happens when you get in the silt. You just lose all visibility.
When that happens, there's no panic? You don't get nervous? Or
Well, you know, if you're going to panic in that situation, you're in the wrong hobby. And I don't mean that snide. I mean that with most seriousness. We develop a set of skills depending on the dive. In the U-boat, I don't use a penetration line. In many other shipwrecks or in cave diving, you have to have a continuous guideline to get you back out. It seems like I'm being glib, but you're in a tube, literally in a tube. There's no way to change deck levels. There's no rooms. There's just little doorways, and there's all kinds of dangly stuff that can get caught on you, but a line is not going to help you navigate around that. So we kind of use a trick that I've been using since I was a kid, which is called progressive penetration. where when you go in, you memorize landmarks. So like when I would be swimming out, if I touch that torpedo, well, I know that when I get to the shroud, now I've got to dodge right, because then there'll be a circular opening to get through the hatch. And it's these kind of things that in zero visibility, you can almost close your eyes and braille dive. That's a term we use, braille dive out. Now, we also try to operate in such a way as to not disturb the visibility as much as possible, but sometimes it's literally impossible. There's just no way that you can enter a compartment that has 70 years of silt built up and not expect to disturb the visibility. Swimming forward now, you can see gauges and different bits of equipment. And all kinds of electrical switch boxes. And this is the problem that we had, is that not only has the interior of the wreck been encrusted in this marine growth, but it's also deteriorated greatly. I've jumped ahead so that we are entering the aftermost compartment in between the two engines. And you can still see the remains of that trunk. There's the workbench. A lot of the controls for the diesel engines, left and right, as well as ballast controls. You're now looking at the port engine. And there's a contemporary photograph to give you a kind of perspective. You can see the main air induction valves.
This cylinder hanging from the ceiling is the trunk that was lying on the floor, right?
Well, when I found it, it had fallen and wedged itself between the engines. And I needed to unwedge it. And I used a crowbar to do that because it was blocking the way. We couldn't go over it, we couldn't get under it. So in that photograph, you can see the oil tank is wedged up there. And if you go to the video, you'll see now the oil tank is fallen all by itself in between the engines. You can see the escape trunk is laying down in between the two motors. And just to give you an idea of how big these things are, if a man is standing on the deck grates, these engines are as tall as a man. So the engines are, say, 2 meters tall. So that'll give you a perspective of how deep down that oil tank is laying in between the engine now, and how disconcerting it is that things like that could fall on you if you were to swim underneath it. And if we had found it this way, John Chatterton would have never had to take his gear off.
And as Divers Down says, there's a lot of places to get snagged on. As you're filming this video, or any video, taking pictures, whatever, how often are you getting snagged?
Try not to, but it does happen. And again, arresting panic means that you stop, you back up, you find the snag, you get it off of you. We try to move in a shipwreck like church mice. We also try to be very contained, very tight, with not a lot of things dangling or loose that can be snagged. So try to be as streamlined as possible. So now you're going to have a treat, because in this video, I am visiting the wreck. I haven't been here in 10 or 15 years. And I am like shocked that the oil tank is now fallen, because I am swimming now where no one ever could swim before. We could never do this. And now, within seconds, what took John Chatterton a number of dives to achieve, I am now on the opposite end of the diesel engine room, about to go through the door leading into the electric motor room.
Which is where John had to go to get that box.
That is correct. And you're going to see a few as we go into the room. Now that's the starboard electric motor that we're looking at. And you can see one of the boxes sitting on the floor right in front of it, a big one. And a lot of the electric motor controls are still in place, but the gauges, as you can see, have popped out. You can see the fuse box. This will give you an idea of how things are covered up. I noticed this tag, but you can't read any writing on it. But then I'm going to take my finger and I'm going to rub it. And then all of a sudden, after 70 years now, you can actually read German writing. So you can see how things can become camouflaged. And as I move further aft, there is a lathe on the right-hand side, and then there's a welder behind it, and there's the access to the after torpedo room. And that is a manifold for pressure gauges. You can see another box right there. There was, I think, 180 boxes of spare parts. And now you could see how we couldn't get in on this end because the hull has been bent straight down by depth charge damage, and there was no way to get in. And as I'm pushing around, I'm just illuminating and showing different kinds of gauges. Believe it or not, the person in that video is Andrew Nagel, who is Bill Nagel's son. And I took him diving and brought him inside the U-869 with me, which in a way was something his father never got the opportunity to do. Bill Nagel died the second year of our work on the wreck.
And he was the one that essentially was the first to discover it, not identify it, but discover it.
That is correct. I'm just swimming out right now, and there's Andrew waiting for me. And you see the two valves above my head right now, which are the main air induction valves. And you can see the amount of destruction of this particular compartment and how the submarine was totally blown apart.
I want to post the comment here. Max Yerger says that video is amazing. This video is on your YouTube channel, correct?
That is correct.
Just search for Richie Kohler and you'll come across it.
That's correct.
Yeah, so if you guys want to check out this video again, I mean, of course you can see it here, but check out Richie Kohler's YouTube channel. Subscribe to his YouTube channel if you haven't already, and you can play that video as much as you want. I'd love to have you back on and even just go through some of the stuff that's behind you, you know.
All lawfully recovered.
Yeah, I have no doubt, but we'd love to have you back if that's something you'd be interested in.
More than happy. You guys are great, and I had a good time.
Any last questions before we let Richie off the hook, guys?
No, just can't thank you enough.
Yes, thank you so much for
Absolutely.
coming on tonight.
Can't tell, it's been my pleasure, guys.
I'm sure I speak for all of us. If you're ever at any of our museums, you're more than welcome.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, it's been a thrill to have Richie Kohler on with us. Before we let you go, because I do want to point out, over the summer, I think you were at Bikini to dive on the nuclear...
No, over the summer I was in Truck Lagoon.
Oh, okay, that's where you were.
I was trying to get to Bikini, but a typhoon got in my way, and I was stuck for a week in Honolulu. The typhoon hit. Kwajalein escaped damage, but Guam got whacked. And the way that it works out there is the flights have to go island hopping. So with Guam Airport knocked out of commission, you couldn't go to Kwajalein unless you were on a military flight. And so all civilian transport was grounded. I spent 7 days in Honolulu waiting for the airport to open up in Guam so that the flight could get me to Kwajalein. And it never happened. So Bikini is on my bucket list.
So that's where you're heading to next?
No, believe it or not, one of my favorite places to dive is the English Channel, or basically anywhere in the UK. I go almost every year from Gosport in the east all the way to Donegal, Ireland in the western approaches. And the thing I love about UK waters is that If it's a lawful abandoned shipwreck, recovery is permitted of certain artifacts as long as you report them to the receiver of wreck. So therefore, a lot of the artifacts that you see have been lawfully recovered from the shipwrecks that lay at the bottom of the English Channel. So that's one of my favorite places to go diving, as you can tell.
And if people want to learn more about what you've got going on, is the website richiekohler.com?
You got it.
And the YouTube channel, simply search for Richie Kohler. If you guys have not checked out the other videos out there of Richie's activities, I strongly recommend it. The video where he was commenting earlier, you can find that on his YouTube channel. Check it out. Become a subscriber. You guys are going to love it. I was hooked on it. Richie Kohler, thank you for joining us tonight. I can't say that enough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Richie.
All right, man. So we're going to let you go, and then we're going to talk behind your back.
There you go.
All right. Yeah, you have a great night.
Bye now.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So what the hell was that all about?
That was great.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
That was pretty fascinating.
It was.
mhm.
One thing I noticed right off the bat, I've not been on a U-boat, but I've been on 3 World War II American subs, and you can definitely tell there's a size difference, even just through that video. They seemed more compact for sure than their American counterparts. That's something that I noticed right off the bat when I was looking at that footage.
What he was giving and describing, in the engine room, and he says, well, it's about 2 meters or 6 feet or whatever. If that silt might be 4 feet off the deck.
Yeah.
Right. So, I mean, I get it. It seems pretty, the diameter of the pressure hull doesn't seem that great, but
If I can,
yes,
if
you take a deck,
Yeah. Well, I was referring more to width, like not so much the height, but like the width. It just seemed smaller. The other thing I'm going to make a comment on is that was very interesting to just kind of hear his opinion on the removal and display of these artifacts.
Richie sent an email basically saying, great chat. Look forward to seeing the edited version. If you're serious about me coming back, I would be more than happy.
100%.
Yeah, I'd love to have him back. I thought he was fantastic.
Yeah.
so one of the things I was,
So hold on a second. Let me interrupt you. Since you did not know the story, you didn't know him from like Deep Sea Detectives on the History Channel. What are your thoughts?
that was a very moving story, and he's had many years to tell it, right? Like he hit all of the major points to me about remembering and forgetting and families and how important it was as a war wreck artifact to treat it rightly. And he tells it in a very compelling way. I wanted to hear more, and I guess maybe I should read the book about the miscommunication with the radio. Did they not have their antenna up, or
In the book, yeah.
okay,
Yeah.
then I might have to read through that. But yeah, that was very compelling to me, is how they missed orders, and then all of a sudden this happens, and why. Thanks, Frank.
Check out the Nova documentary too. What was interesting about the Nova documentary, he said that they didn't want to air it until family members were notified, that type of thing. But once the Nova documentary aired, apparently in Germany, a crew member of the U-869 actually came forward. I forget why he was off the sub, but
He was sick.
yeah, so
In the
he was
hospital.
sick. Yeah, he was taken off the sub, and that's when it went on its last voyage. And he was under the impression that it had gone down off of Rabat, by Casablanca. And I forget the guy's name, but there's really some interesting stories. There was an interview about him. He was a radio man also. That Horenberg guy who had carved his name in the knife was the lead radio man on the sub. And he made a comment. It's like, hey, look, could Horenberg have made a mistake in the broadcast? He said, absolutely not. That guy knew what he was doing. So it's a real interesting story.
And does it also mention how many family members of the crew they were able to locate?
That I don't remember. John,
Okay.
do you recall that?
I don't.
One thing, though, he talks about finding remains, and, he pauses the video and he sees remains. And then I can't help but wonder what goes through his mind when he starts to see pictures like this of the crew. What I'm going to do is, I want to say thanks to Richie Kohler for joining us tonight. That was a thrill. He stayed on a hell of a lot longer than we originally talked about. And he did send me an email saying that he wanted to come back on. So that's fantastic. We'll have him on again. So definitely want to say thanks to Richie Kohler. Check out richiekohler.com. And you can search for his YouTube channel, Richie Kohler, in the search bar. Definitely check it out. Good videos on there. He's going other places. He still continues to dive all the time. So there's all kinds of great photos and video to check out there. So thanks to Richie. Thank you, everyone, for joining us tonight. It was a long episode, but it was totally worth it. Hope you enjoyed it. I know I definitely did. And we'll have Richie Kohler on again in the future. For John Epp on the Slater, Shane Stevenson, Buffalo Naval Park, and Connor Kilgore, Transportation Museum of Thunder Bay. My name is Ken Stana with the YouTube channel History X. Thanks for watching tonight, and everyone have a good evening.
Night, everybody.
Good night.